In 2007, a field survey was launched by the Kinneret Regional Project, or KRP, at the site of Horvat Kur in the Galilee of Israel. The goal of this project was to examine a rural Galilean site from the late Hellenistic to Byzantine periods, so the 1st century BCE to 7th century CE, in order to answer the following research questions. How did an average rural settlement from the Hellenistic to Byzantine period in this region function? How did such a settlement interrelate to the human-made or natural transformations of its surrounding landscape? And how does such a village relate to the wider Mediterranean context? With that focus, KRP wants to contribute to the ongoing discussion on the living conditions in and cultural influences on a region that has historically been overlooked as a part of the broader Eastern Mediterranean economy and trade networks. Based on this historical map from 1888 made by Gottlieb Schumacher, ruins were indeed discovered on top of the Horvat Kur. And in 2008, several test trenches were opened. One on the northeastern edge of the plateau, Area A, and another one 40 meters to the north on a lower building terrace, Area B. In Area B, we hit bedrock rather quickly, but Area A proved more prolific. Here, a stone large block called the steps, 2 parallel walls, pottery, glass, coins, many roof tiles, and enough sediment were found to allow us to assign the remains to late Roman and early Byzantine periods. In addition, a systematic survey in the vicinity in 2007 to 2009 showed that the region was intensely settled and used for agriculture in the periods contemporaneous to the main habitation on Horvat Kur. In 2009, a study season was organized to examine the remains and to come up with an excavation plan. The first full fieldwork season was conducted in 2010 by a team sponsored by the University of Bern in Switzerland, the University of Helsinki in Finland, and Leiden University, the Netherlands. A new trench was opened, Area C, in which we discovered remains of 2 domestic units, each dating to the Byzantine period. From Unit 1, a section of the courtyard with installations, a pavement floor, and a line of 3 interior rooms of the adjacent house were found. From Unit 2, just south of Unit 1, only the entrance area. Both units were separated by a narrow alley. The steps and parallel walls found in Area A, however, turned out not to belong to domestic housing, but they were the entrance and outer walls of a large community building that turned out to be an ancient synagogue. The subsequent seasons 2011 through 2018 were entirely focused on the synagogue in Area A, now also joined by 2 American co-partners, Central College in Kentucky and the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The discovery of a new synagogue was not planned in our original research design, but immediately impressed us with the information it contained. The synagogue is a rectangular building of 11 meters by 16.5 meters, mainly built of basalt ashlars. As for the phasing, we currently believe that a first synagogue was built here between 340 and 400 CE. In a second phase, the synagogue was enlarged into a broad house type, and more prominent features, which we will discuss later, were added. This probably happened around 430 CE. The last phase came about around 600 CE, probably because of an earthquake, which caused the northeastern corner of the building to collapse. The building, as we have it now, has 2 entrances, a double-winged opening in the western wall and a narrower one in the south wall next to the bima. The bima once served to support the Torah shrine superstructure. Unlike the rest of the preserved part of the synagogue, the bima is constructed of high quality, very carefully dressed limestones. It must have been nicely decorated, as fragments of a lion relief, a wreath, and a couple of decorated architectural elements were found nearby. Inside the bima, we found a decent quantity of coins and glass fragments, and a bronze oil lamp from the Roman period. Due to heavy robbing, the exact form of the bima must unfortunately remain hypothetical. But it seems likely that the Horvat Kur bima resembled its much better preserved cousin at El Kanatir, shown here on the right lower corner. The synagogue floor consists of layers of plain gray plaster, but nearly 100,000 colorful single mosaic stones or tesserae were found in different fills in and around the synagogue, suggesting that the first phase of the building had a mosaic floor. A small patch of this mosaic floor was indeed found still in situ in the southeast corner of the hall. Here, we can see a colored guilloche pattern with inside a panel surrounded by a red line. Only the top of one panel has been preserved, showing a menorah and an Aramaic inscription, which can be read as Elazar bar Yudan bar Susu. One of our other spectacular finds is the so-called Seat of Moses. This is a limestone block found in situ on top of the bench inside the synagogue. The block had been worked into the form of a seat with a rim and armrests and was plastered into place on top of the bench. The location and prominence of the seat suggest that it was used by some important member of the community during synagogue gatherings. Our last big find was what we call Horvat Kur stone. This is a basalt stone shaped like a low table and decorated with figurative elements on one side, which we like to call the show side, and geometric patterns on the other three sides and on the top. The show side features several figurative representations, including candelabri and vessels for liquids, specifically a vase, 2 jugs, and a ladle or simpulum. The stone was found plastered into the floor and between 2 columns, indicating that it was placed here in secondary use. Our final important discovery came about in 2011. During this campaign, a student lifted the stone immediately outside the northwest corner of the building and discovered, to her surprise, not the suspected layer of soil, but a big gaping hole. The hole turned out to be a bell-shaped cistern of 6 meters deep, 8.5 meter long east-west, and 7.1 meter wide north-south, almost forming a square. Following a first inspection still that year, excavations in the cistern were carried out in 2012 and 2016, and we currently have a third program scheduled. Before we turn to the finds, though, we first present a brief description of the cistern. The stratigraphy comprises 2 major strata. The lower consists of a clean, thick layer of very fine and very hard compacted silt. The upper stratum, which includes the cone underneath the mouth of the cistern, consists of looser soil and is actually made up of a number of distinct layers that slope down towards the walls of the cistern. The lower stratum is remarkable in terms of the character and preservation of ceramic artifacts. Using the method of minimum number of vessels, we have so far identified 40 vessels from the stratum, with more awaiting study and classification. Most of these vessels are either intact or almost completely restorable. A small number is only partially preserved or restorable. There are various types of jugs, 1- and 2-handled, with or without a spout, and cooking pots of varying sizes. All have published parallels except one, a 2-handled jar or table amphora with white painted decoration. It also appears that all vessels were regionally manufactured. The majority, 33 of them, conforms to the Kafar Hanania fabric and repertoire which was common in the region during the Roman and early Byzantine periods. The painted vessel resembles Kafar Hanania ware, but because of its being unusual, we have taken a sample to check this hypothesis. 3 vessels belong to an unprovenance group that is almost certainly also regional. One suggestion being the Carmel or a little further north. It is a brownish quartz-rich fabric that appeared sometime in the second half of the 4th century CE and is a predominant fabric for cooking and related vessels at Byzantine Horvat Kur. Because of the limited functional repertoire and scarcity of other artifacts, we believe that this lower stratum represents the phase when the cistern was still being used as a water reservoir, the hard compacted soil being the stagnant silt that accumulated during that phase. Since no vessels show any obvious traces of soot, we assume that they were reserved for hauling up water. This slide showing the effect of repeated use and or contact, which cause small chips or flakes to come off. In those cases, when the rope around the handle or the handle itself broke off, the pot would fall into the water and sink into the silt, only to be found by us. Most of the vessels are typologically dated to the 4th and first half of the 5th century CE, hinting at a phase of use of around 400 CE, just as was observed for a cistern in nearby Meron and of slightly younger date, a cistern at Sepphoris. The second stratum is completely different. Much of the pottery is very fragmented, while a number of joining fragments of different vessels points to the groups of objects or fragments with different life histories. For this pottery, we employed full sherd and weight quantification using fabric and shape as parameters for classification. And here, we show the quantified summary for locus 7253 by category, function, and general provenance. Note the high percentage of kitchen pottery. In addition to preservation, the function and provenance of the pottery from the upper stratum are also partly different. Fragments of Kafar Hananya ware and the quartz-rich fabric are common here too, but also identified are regional and imported amphorae, for example, from the Meander Valley and Sinope. And here on the right, we can see a partly restored specimen from Area C that is datable to the 6th century, probably from Sinope, as well as late Roman sea vessels from Western Asia Minor. In fact, the makeup of this pottery generally resembles that from the 2 domestic units in Area C. We believe the second stratum represents the archaeological residue of dumping activities. This raises the important question whether the cistern had already lost its primary function prior to, or did it so because of this dumping. Pottery in this upper stratum suggests this dumping happened around the middle or the second half of the 6th century CE. And while it is certainly tempting to relate it to a large event, such as the earthquake of 551 CE, it might have also resulted from a local event, for example, the renovation of a nearby structure, which would strengthen the idea that the cistern had already lost its original function. Inhabitants would probably not put the cistern out of use by throwing in waste without having a good reason to do so. Cisterns, after all, literally had a vital function. Moreover, to whom did the cistern belong? Who was responsible for its maintenance and who used it? We are presently unable to say whether the dumping was a single event or whether it took place over a longer period of time, months, years, perhaps 1 to a few decades. We don't know. Since the second stratum did not have a homogeneous matrix and instead consisted of various layers, this favors the latter scenario. We will revisit this question once we can access the material again. Last, let us take a look at 2 intact cooking pots that were found on top of the fill. Both are in the Byzantine period brown quartz-rich fabric and of the same type, although of different size. Because this type has a very long date range, we cannot be very precise. But the absence of Umayyad and younger pottery in the cistern, which is found in parts of the stratigraphy both in the synagogue and in Area C, provide us with a terminus antiquem for their placement, probably not too long after the dumping and basically prior to the cistern's closing. One idea might be that these mark a sort of termination deposit. So what do we think? The stratigraphic and artifact evidence from this cistern points to distinctly different uses, each dependent on time-specific circumstances. While once it supplied inhabitants with water, a change in circumstance prompted people to start throwing in waste. The pottery can point to domestic waste, which perhaps partly came from beaten earth floors, which would explain the residual and more fragmented pottery, and partly from some family ceramic instrumentum domesticum. We cannot, however, exclude the idea that it originated from the synagogue area, as similar ceramic categories were also found both in and outside the synagogue. Can we, for example, associate this dumping with the last major structural work of the synagogue very shortly after 600 CE? What we have highlighted here is only one part of the cistern story, and we have limited ourselves to an introduction of the site and current ideas regarding the stratigraphy in the cistern and the ceramic finds, naturally also thinking of this in relation to Horvat Kur above ground. Indeed, the future integration also of the analysis of the glass, bone, metal, and stone finds will surely help us to further understand the complex history of this cistern and its relation to the village and people of Horvat Kur. We kindly thank you for your attention.